In the late 1950s, following the death of Stalin, the relationship between China and the USSR started to get more openly hostile. A lot of Stalin's crimes, however you want to characterize them, a lot of the atrocities that he was responsible came to light after he died, and the higher ups in the Chinese Communist Party were privy to some of the secret kind of behind the scenes discussions of things that he had done before that kind of data became available to the West. So, around that period, China decided to ditch and try to move away from all of their Russian influence. They had been very heavily influenced by Russia just in terms of their technology, the kind of technology that they were developing, the industry that they were developing, the models that they were developing, and the education even that they were developing was all heavily based on Russian technology. And there are a lot of Russian technocrats that had gone over to China during that period in the decades previous, following the revolution, in order to help the Chinese industrialize in a very short period of time. So, following the death of Stalin and in this period of increasing hostility between Russia and China decided to ditch all of these influences, and they decided to stop doing this whole 5-year plan thing that they had picked up from Russia. They did their first 5-year plan, which was heavily concentrated on very quick and rapid industrialization of mostly based in the urban centers. And during that period, they concentrated a lot of their ideological as well as a lot of their material resources on the urban proletariat at the expense of the rural agricultural workers, which really formed the base of the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, they're Russian, but their revolution was accomplished via the rural peasantry. And this is not to say that they entirely neglected the rural peasantry. They did, after all, do land reform during around that time before the period that I'm talking about, which is obviously a humongous thing, and they collectivized a massive amount of farms during that period. But this is all to say that there's definitely a growing disparity between the urban core and the urban kind of technocrats and managerial class and the kind of rural peasantry. So there was a decision made at this point not to do a second 5-year plan, but to embark on something called the Great Leap, which was meant to be, Mao's belief was that they had done enough socialism that they could now do communism. They're through this transitionary phase, and they're now going to do communism, and that is how they still need to do a lot of work on the country's infrastructure in terms of developing its productive capacities, its productive forces, as well as developing agriculture. But no longer would they be utilizing the capitalist kind of means, like a kind of state capitalism that would be under control of the Chinese Communist Party, but would still be capitalist essentially, which is what socialism in transition is meant to be. It's meant to be a state capitalism that is again controlled by the dictatorship of the proletariat, but it is still capitalism. It is still fundamentally a capitalist mode of production. So they decide to ditch that. Now they're going to be communist. They're ready. They're at the point where they could be full-on communist. And what that meant for them, during this period of the Great Leap, is that they would, previously they had started doing collectivization of farms. So all these farms throughout China, which is, obviously with the vast majority, hundreds and hundreds of millions of Chinese peasants were engaged in agricultural labor, all that had been collectivized. So like these Chinese peasants were the land was owned in common by like a kind of village commune, and the like value of what was produced was distributed according to the labor that was put in. But now everything was going to be owned in common, so there would be no private property. No like individual peasant could own like their own or like cultivate their own land for themselves, which is still something that peasants were doing under collectivization. And they couldn't own their own animals or whatever, their own livestock. Everything would be owned in common, and everything would be distributed according to need, which in practice, because their agricultural output hadn't actually developed enough in order to feed the growing population, in order to, be able to feed the urban core. A lot of their agricultural produce had to be heavily taxed in order to again feed this managerial class that was growing, the urban proletariat. So anyway, they began this whole process of communization, basically turning these collectives into communes where everybody would live in common, everybody would work in common, and everything would be owned in common, and everybody had to do like a lot of labor. Like the labor standards at this period were going up because again they were trying to still, even as they were going into like this communist mode of production, as they were trying to move into communism, they still realized that they needed to further develop their industrial output, their productive forces. They needed to still continue developing industry as well as agriculture. So another thing that they did, basically what I find very fascinating about this period of the Great Leap, is how they began to develop like medium and light industry and to kind of like spread it more evenly throughout the countryside. So whereas heavy industry was more heavily concentrated in the urban centers, we're talking about like steel production and kind of, I don't know, like coal mining or like oil refinery, or I don't know, all of these like heavy kind of industries where you need like these very like centralized kind of manufacturing factories. It's manufacturing, not so much, and it depends on. I think manufacturing of like raw resources rather than manufacturing of like commodity goods. But during the Great Leap, there's this greater emphasis on moving like light and medium manufacturing to the countryside, and so what this meant in practice was that there would be like smaller kind of like fertilizer production facilities kind of distributed more evenly throughout the country, and it would be producing fertilizer to like the farms, for the farms that were closely located around it. And as well you would get like small commodities like consumer goods to a limited extent, probably like tools and like just daily essentials, necessities, that kinds of things, rather than like more like elaborate or difficult to produce like luxury goods. Perhaps would probably still be relegated to urban centers, but like these kinds of like daily things that could be easily manufactured in the countryside in kind of like smaller production facilities were done so. And also some forms of light kind of resources were produced. But I think that is just really incredibly interesting, this move to like spread out production so that it's not centralized. I think that is really what we need to be thinking about in terms of even like that is just so relevant to me, to our contemporary, to like any kind of vision of a sustainable and ecologically sustainable communist revolution. This is something that I talked about in a recent interview that I did with Mr. Jasper Burns. talking about like Marx's concept of the metabolic rift and his Marx's concerns about like depletion of soil nitrates and this kind of division between the town and countryside. But I think, yeah, so it's just really fascinating to me, and I think it's very relevant thinking about, like, in a post-revolutionary context, how is like a revolutionary society going to live in a sustainable way, in a way that is in harmony with the environment around it. I think we really need to think about producing goods in a smaller quantity and more evenly distributed around the countryside, just basically being closer to the things that you're producing, particularly food. That's like a very obvious one. We all need to be much closer to the food that we're consuming, but as well the idea of producing some commodity goods and some like important resources and being like close to where they're being produced and manufactured is very exciting and interesting idea to me. And also everything being produced communally, everything being owned communally and distributed according to need is obviously very important. That's like a revolutionary communist principle is to each according to their need. That is communism, whereas socialism is to each according to from each according to their ability or whatever. There's some like minor difference there, but in terms of phrasing, but the actual principle is very important. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I just think it's very interesting. And, you know, on this channel, I'm a Maoist, I guess, for whatever that might be worth. But lately I've been reading a lot of communization theory, and I just find it like really very bizarre to me how none of these guys at any point stop to think about revolutionary China or like the historical experiences of China. And you know, they're very critical of Leninism, which, you know, whatever, they're coming out of a whole thing that is critical of Leninism. There's a whole end of the USSR. That's fine, whatever. But, you know, there's a lot to learn from China, and nobody's talking about it, folks. So, yeah, I just think that is a very interesting model that was explored in the late 50s in China during the Great Leap period, the Great Leap Forward, of kind of like distributing production around the countryside, a vast countryside, so that there would be less wastage in terms of transporting over vast distances, and also, you know, just so that we could all be a lot closer to the things that we're producing and consuming. Anyway, hope you found that interesting, and I'll see you next time.